The sun was just starting to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The sprawling military base came alive with the sound of boots hitting the ground, orders being barked out, and the distant hum of vehicles moving around. It was a new day, and for the fresh batch of recruits standing nervously in formation, it marked the beginning of something they weren't sure they were ready for. Among them stood a tall, athletic young man who carried himself with quiet confidence. He had worked hard to get here. This wasn't just some random decision, it was a lifeline. Growing up in a tough neighborhood where opportunities were scarce, he'd always dreamed of more. Joining the army felt like his ticket out, a chance to prove himself, to rise above the struggles that had defined his early life. His dreams weren't small either. He wanted to climb the ranks, earn respect, and maybe one day lead others. But, as fate would have it, not everyone at the base shared his vision or intentions. Enter Sergeant Harold Iron Fist Dawson, a grizzled veteran known across the camp for two things: his brutal training methods and his sharp tongue. Dawson had been around long enough to see countless recruits come and go, and he prided himself on weeding out the weak ones quickly. To him, basic training wasn't just about preparing soldiers, it was about breaking them down first so they could be rebuilt into something stronger. From the moment Dawson walked onto the field, clipboard in hand, scanning the sea of nervous faces, there was an unmistakable tension in the air. His eyes landed on the young recruit almost immediately. There was something about him, his posture, his calm demeanor, that seemed to irritate Dawson right off the bat. Maybe it was the way he stood a little taller than the rest, or how he didn't flinch when Dawson's gaze lingered on him longer than necessary. Whatever it was, it set the tone for what was to come. "Listen up," Dawson barked, his voice cutting through the morning stillness like a knife. "You're all maggots until you prove otherwise, and trust me, most of you won't." His piercing glare moved from one face to another before settling back on the young recruit. "Private Thompson," he said, reading off the clipboard. "I don't care where you came from or what you think you're worth. You'll earn your place here, or crawl out like the rest of your kind." The words hung heavy in the air, and though no one dared say anything, the tension among the group was palpable. Some recruits exchanged uneasy glances while others shifted, uncomfortably in their boots. They'd heard stories about Dawson, the man who lived up to his nickname, and none of them wanted to draw his ire. But Private Thompson? He didn't even blink. Instead, he locked eyes with Dawson for a brief second, his expression unreadable. Then, without missing a beat, he replied firmly, "Yes, Sergeant." It was a simple response, but it spoke volumes. For Dawson, it only fueled the fire brewing inside him. Something about this recruit rubbed him the wrong way, and he made it clear from that very first encounter that Private Thompson would be singled out. Whether it was during push-ups, obstacle courses, or drills, Dawson found ways to make things harder for him. Extra laps, extra weight, extra scrutiny. It became a pattern and everyone noticed. Despite the unfair treatment, Private Thompson refused to let it break him. If anything, it pushed him to work harder. Where others might have crumbled under the pressure, he dug deeper, determined to show Dawson that he couldn't be intimidated. His resilience didn't go unnoticed either. A few of the recruits began looking up to him, quietly admiring his ability to keep going despite the odds stacked against him. One person, in particular, took notice. Corporal Elena Ramirez, a medic, trainee with a sharp mind and a strong sense of justice. She saw right through Dawson's behavior and decided to keep an eye on Private Thompson, offering subtle support whenever she could. As the days turned into weeks, Dawson's hostility toward Private Thompson grew more intense. What started as minor annoyances escalated into full-blown attempts to break him. During one particularly grueling morning exercise, Dawson ordered Private Thompson to redo the same wall climb 5 times in a row, each attempt accompanied by biting remarks meant to rattle him. "Is this why people like you don't belong in uniform?" Dawson sneered after the 5th failed attempt. Too weak to handle a little pain? For a moment, it looked like Private Thompson might finally crack. His breathing was labored, sweat dripping down his face, and his hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of the wall. But instead of crumbling, something shifted in his expression. Anger flickered in his eyes, but it wasn't reckless, it was controlled, calculated. Slowly, he turned to face Dawson, his voice steady despite the exhaustion. "I'm stronger than you'll ever know, Sergeant. And one day you'll regret treating me this way." The entire group froze, holding their breath. No one had ever talked back to Dawson like that, at least not without facing serious consequences. Sure enough, Dawson's face darkened and he marched Private Thompson straight to the commander's office for insubordination. But while Private Thompson paid the price for speaking out, his words lingered in the minds of those who heard them. They planted a seed of doubt, not just about Dawson's methods, but also about Private Thompson's true identity. Because, if he was willing to stand up to someone like Dawson, then maybe there was more to him than met the eye. Little did anyone know, the real story was only just beginning. The days blurred into weeks and the brutal rhythm of military life settled in like a storm that refused to pass. Every morning began with the shrill sound of a whistle, followed by Dawson's barking voice slicing through the cold air. The recruits were pushed to their limits, running until their legs burned, doing push-ups until their arms gave out, and navigating obstacle courses designed to test both strength and willpower. But for one recruit, the challenges weren't just physical, they were personal. Dawson had made it clear from day one that this particular recruit was his target. It wasn't subtle anymore. It was as if he'd declared war. While the others struggled under the weight of standard training, this young man faced an entirely different level of scrutiny. Push-ups turned into marathons. Simple tasks became opportunities for public humiliation, and every mistake, even minor ones, was blown out of proportion. Dawson seemed determined to break him, not because he saw weakness, but because he wanted to prove a point. And everyone knew it. One morning, during an obstacle course drill, Dawson's voice rang out louder than usual. "You call that climbing? My grandmother could do better," he shouted, pointing at the recruit who was struggling to scale a towering wall. The rest of the group watched nervously, knowing what was coming next. Sure enough, Dawson stepped closer, his boots crunching against the gravel beneath him. "Drop down and give me 20, he ordered, his tone dripping with disdain. "And if you can't handle it, maybe you should reconsider why you're even here." The recruit dropped to the ground without hesitation, his movements deliberate, despite the exhaustion etched across his face. He didn't argue, didn't complain, he just did as he was told. That was his way, stoic, unyielding, almost unnerving in its calmness. But inside, something was shifting. Each insult, each jab, chipped away at his patience. He wasn't angry, not yet, but there was a growing fire within him, fueled by determination rather than hatred. As the weeks dragged on, Dawson's behavior grew more intense. During a long march through muddy terrain, he singled the recruit out again, this time questioning his intelligence. "Do you even understand what I'm saying, or am I wasting my breath?" he sneered, loud enough for the entire group to hear. The words stung, not because they were true, but because they were meant to cut deep. Other recruits lowered their heads, avoiding eye contact, while Corporal Elena Ramirez clenched her fists behind her back. She'd seen enough. Dawson's cruelty wasn't just about toughening them up. It was about tearing someone down piece by piece. But the recruit wasn't crumbling. If anything, he was getting stronger. His resilience earned him quiet respect among some of the others, though many kept their distance, afraid of being caught in Dawson's crossfire. Still, Elena noticed how he handled himself. When Dawson yelled, he listened. When Dawson pushed, he pushed back, not with words but with action. He ran faster, climbed higher, and worked harder than anyone else. It was as if Dawson's attempts to break him only sharpened his resolve. Then came the day that changed everything. It was early morning, and the recruits were lined up for inspection. Dawson moved down the row, scrutinizing uniforms, boots, and gear with hawk-like precision. When he reached the targeted recruit, he stopped abruptly, narrowing his eyes. "What's this?" he snapped, pulling a small notebook from the recruit's pocket. Flipping through the pages, Dawson scowled. "Notes on tactics? Planning to lecture us, are you?" The recruit stood perfectly still, his expression unreadable. "Just trying to improve, Sergeant," he replied evenly. Dawson scoffed, tossing the notebook back at him. "Improvement doesn't come from books, it comes from sweat and blood. Maybe you're too soft for that." With a dismissive wave, he moved on, leaving the recruit standing there gripping the notebook tightly. Later that day, during another grueling exercise, Dawson pushed him harder than ever before. After forcing him to redo the same wall climb, 5 times Dawson leaned in close, his voice low and venomous. "Is this why people like you don't belong in uniform? Too weak to handle a little pain?" That was the moment the recruit snapped. Slowly, deliberately, he turned to face Dawson, his chest rising and falling with exertion. For a split second, the entire field went silent, all eyes fixed on the 2 men locked in a tense standoff. Then, in a voice steady and clear, the recruit spoke. "I'm stronger than you'll ever know, Sergeant, and one day you'll regret treating me this way." The words hung in the air like thunderclouds, heavy and charged with emotion. Dawson's face flushed red, his jaw tightening as he processed the audacity of the response. No one talked back to him. Not like this. Not without consequences. Without hesitation, he grabbed the recruit by the arm and marched him straight to the commander's office, shouting accusations of insubordination along the way. Word spread quickly among the other recruits. Some admired the courage it took to stand up to Dawson, while others worried about the fallout. Elena, however, felt a flicker of hope. She'd seen the toll Dawson's treatment was taking, not just on the recruit but on the morale of the entire group. Something had to change, and maybe, just maybe, this confrontation would be the catalyst. Inside the commander's office, the recruit faced disciplinary action. He accepted the punishment without argument, knowing full well that fighting back verbally wouldn't undo the damage Dawson had already done. But as he walked back to the barracks later that evening, he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play. Dawson's obsession with breaking him felt personal, like there was more to it than met the eye. That night, as the recruits settled into their bunks, whispers filled the room. What was really going on between Dawson and this one recruit? Why did Dawson seem so fixated on him? And most importantly, what secrets lay hidden beneath the surface? No one had answers yet, but one thing was certain. The tension was reaching a boiling point. Whatever happened next, it was bound to shake the foundation of the entire base. The days that followed the confrontation were tense, like a storm cloud lingering overhead, refusing to break. Everyone on the base could feel it. The unease, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. Dawson's behavior toward the recruit hadn't softened. If anything, it had grown more calculated. It wasn't just about yelling or making him run extra laps anymore. Now there was an edge to it, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere cruelty. The other recruits couldn't help but notice how Dawson seemed to be watching this one young man with a mix of suspicion and something else. Fear? Curiosity? No one could quite put their finger on it. Meanwhile, whispers began to spread. Rumors have a way of taking root in places like this, tight-knit groups where everyone eats, sleeps, and trains together. At first they were harmless enough. Someone claimed the recruit had been handpicked by high-ranking officers for reasons no one understood. Another said he'd completed advanced training before enlisting, though no one knew where or why. These stories floated around like smoke. Impossible to pin down, but impossible to ignore. And then there was the photo. It happened during a routine inspection, a mundane task that usually involved Dawson barking orders while recruits scrambled to make sure their lockers were spotless. This time, however, Dawson lingered longer than usual at one particular locker. When he opened it, his eyes immediately landed on a small framed picture tucked inside. His expression shifted instantly, from irritation to confusion, then to something darker. He picked up the photo, studying it closely, his jaw tightening as he realized what he was looking at. In the picture, the recruit stood side by side with none other than General Robert Callahan, the commanding officer of the entire division. Both men wore proud smiles, their body language relaxed and familiar, as if they shared a bond that went beyond rank. To Dawson, this wasn't just a random snapshot, it was proof that something was off. Who exactly was this recruit? Why did he have a personal connection to someone as powerful as General Callahan? And why hadn't anyone mentioned it before? Dawson didn't say a word about the photo, not right away. Instead, he slipped it into his pocket and continued the inspection as if nothing had happened. But later, when the recruits were dismissed, he retreated to his quarters, closing the door behind him with a heavy thud. Sitting alone at his desk, he pulled out the photo again and stared at it, his mind racing. Something about this felt wrong. Not the picture itself, but the implications. If this recruit really had ties to General Callahan, then Dawson's actions might not go unnoticed for much longer. He decided to dig deeper. Using connections he'd built over years of service, Dawson started asking questions. At first, he kept his inquiries vague, pretending to be curious about personnel rotations or recent enlistments. But as he pieced together fragments of information, a clearer picture began to emerge, one that made his stomach churn. The recruit wasn't just another name on a roster. His father had been a decorated war hero, someone who had saved General Callahan's life decades ago during a mission gone horribly wrong. Quen 2.5 Max. The tension on the base had reached a boiling point, and it felt like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the next shoe to drop. Dawson, now armed with unsettling information about the recruit's background, wasn't about to back down. If anything, he doubled down on his mission to break him, only this time there was a desperation in his actions that hadn't been there before. It was as if he knew he was running out of time, and every moment he spent targeting, the recruit carried the risk of someone higher up noticing. But Dawson didn't care. He'd built his career on fear and control, and he wasn't about to let some kid with connections undermine his authority. One night, after hours of grueling drills, Dawson ordered the recruit to clean the latrines, a task reserved for those who had displeased him in some way. The other recruits groaned inwardly when they heard the command, knowing exactly what it meant. This wasn't just punishment. It was humiliation. And sure enough, as the young man scrubbed the floors late into the night, Dawson appeared, his boots echoing ominously in the empty hallway. "Still here?" Dawson sneered, leaning against the doorway with his arms crossed. His tone was casual, almost mocking, but there was an undercurrent of anger beneath it. "I figured someone like you would have called Daddy by now to get out of this." The recruit paused mid-scrub, his hands gripping the handle of the mop tightly. He didn't turn around right away, choosing instead to take a deep breath and steady himself. When he finally did face Dawson, his expression was calm, almost eerily. "So, I'm not here because of anyone else," he said firmly. "I'm here because I chose to be." Dawson snorted, stepping closer until he was towering over the younger man. "Chose to be? That's rich? You think you're special because of who your daddy was? Newsflash, kid. You're still trash in my book." For a moment, it looked like the recruit might explode. His knuckles whitened around the mop handle, and his jaw clenched so hard it seemed like it might crack. But then, something remarkable happened. Instead of lashing out or retreating, he straightened up, meeting Dawson's glare head-on with a quiet intensity that stopped the sergeant dead in his tracks. "Sergeant," he said evenly, "you can try to break me all you want, but you're fighting a losing battle. My father taught me honor, integrity, and perseverance. And unlike you, I won't let hate define me." Before Dawson could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Both men turned toward the noise, their eyes widening as General Robert Callahan himself rounded the corner, flanked by two officers. The general's presence was commanding, his tall frame and sharp uniform making him impossible to ignore. He took in the scene before him, the recruit standing defiantly despite being surrounded by mops and cleaning supplies, and Dawson hovering nearby with a look of barely concealed panic. "What's going on here, Sergeant?" Callahan asked, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. There was no anger in his tone, just a quiet authority that demanded answers. Dawson froze, caught completely off guard. For once, his usual bravado failed him. "Sir," he stammered, snapping to attention, "just assigning routine duties." "Sir?" Callahan raised an eyebrow, glancing at the recruit who was still holding the mop. "Routine duties at this hour?" he asked, his tone neutral but probing. Without waiting for a response, he turned to the young man. "Is everything all right, soldier?" The recruit hesitated for a split second, weighing his options. He could have played it safe, brushed off the situation, and pretended nothing was wrong. But something inside him pushed him to speak up, not out of spite, but out of principle. "Sir," he began, his voice steady, "Sergeant Dawson has singled me out since day one. He's made training unnecessarily difficult, used language that I believe violates regulations, and tonight, well, you can see for yourself." Callahan listened intently, his expression unreadable. When the recruit finished speaking, the general turned back to Dawson, his gaze piercing. "Sergeant," he said calmly, "is there any truth to these allegations?" Dawson sputtered, trying to defend himself. "Sir, I assure you I've only been doing my job. Pushing recruits to their limits is part of the process." "Pushing them to their limits is one thing," Callahan interrupted, his voice firm. "Now. But creating a hostile environment based on personal bias is another matter entirely." He gestured to the officers accompanying him. "We'll need to discuss this further. Sergeant Dawson, report to my office first thing tomorrow morning." As Callahan walked away, the weight of what had just happened settled over the room. Dawson stood frozen, his face pale, while the recruit exhaled slowly, releasing the tension he'd been carrying for weeks. It wasn't just relief, it was vindication. For the first time since arriving at the base, he felt like he'd been seen, truly seen, for who he was rather than who Dawson wanted him to be. Word of the incident spread quickly among the other recruits. Some were shocked, others elated, but everyone agreed on one thing: something big was about to happen. Elena Ramirez, who had quietly supported the recruit from the start, approached him later that evening. "You did the right thing," she said softly, her voice filled with admiration. "Not everyone would have had the guts to stand up like that." He nodded, offering her a small smile. "It's not about guts," he replied. "It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard." The next morning, the atmosphere on the base was electric. Rumors swirled about what would happen to Dawson, with some speculating he'd be reassigned and others predicting worse. Meanwhile, the recruit went about his duties as usual, refusing to let the drama distract him. He knew better than to celebrate prematurely. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, and he still had plenty to prove, not just to Dawson but to himself. When Dawson arrived at Callahan's office, he found the general seated behind a large desk, his demeanor calm but unyielding. The two officers from the previous night stood nearby, taking notes as Dawson recounted his side of the story. At first, he tried to downplay his behavior, insisting it was all part of toughening up the troops. But as Callahan pressed him with specific examples, details provided by both the recruit and eyewitnesses, Dawson's defenses crumbled. By the end of the meeting, there was no denying the truth. He had crossed a line, and there would be consequences. Later, that afternoon, an announcement was made to the entire division. Sergeant Harold Dawson was being relieved of his duties pending a formal investigation. The news sent shockwaves through the ranks, sparking conversations about leadership, accountability, and the kind of culture they wanted to foster within the military. For many, it was a wake-up call, a reminder that power without integrity could lead to ruin. As for the recruit, he received a heartfelt apology from General Callahan, who revealed that he had personally recommended the young man for enlistment based on his impressive record. "Your father would be proud of you," Callahan said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "And so am I." Though vindicated, the recruit chose not to gloat. Instead, he focused on moving forward, determined to rise above the negativity that had surrounded him. He knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew one thing for certain: he was stronger than anyone had ever given him credit for, including Dawson. The fallout from Dawson's removal rippled through the base like a stone dropped into still water. For weeks, whispers and debates filled every corner of the camp. Some recruits were relieved, glad to see an end to the toxic behavior that had poisoned their training environment. Others felt uneasy, unsure of what this meant for the future. Would things really change, or would another Dawson rise to take his place? The uncertainty hung heavy in the air, but one thing was clear: The young recruit who had stood up to Dawson wasn't just a name anymore, he was a symbol. General Callahan wasted no time addressing the division after Dawson's dismissal. Standing on the parade ground where countless drills had taken place, he spoke with a calm authority that demanded respect. "What happened here is unacceptable," he began, his voice carrying across the rows of soldiers. "Leadership isn't about fear or favoritism. It's about guiding others to become the best versions of themselves. Anyone who forgets that principle has no business wearing this uniform." His words struck a chord with many, especially those who had silently endured Dawson's cruelty. But it wasn't just about punishing bad behavior. Callahan made it clear that real change required effort from everyone. He announced reforms aimed at rooting out discrimination and fostering a culture of accountability. Training sessions on ethics and leadership were added to the schedule, and anonymous reporting channels were established to ensure recruits could speak up without fear of retaliation. It was a bold move, one that signaled a turning point for the entire division. For the young recruit at the center of it all, life didn't slow down. If anything, it sped up. With Dawson gone, the pressure shifted, not because people resented him, but because they expected more. They looked to him now as someone who had faced adversity head-on and refused to back down. That kind of respect came with its own challenges. Every drill, every exercise, every test became an opportunity to prove himself, not just to others, but to himself. He knew the spotlight wasn't going away anytime soon, and he didn't want it to. This was his chance to show that he belonged here, not because of his father's legacy or General Callahan's recommendation, but because of who he was. Elena Ramirez continued to stand by him, offering quiet support whenever she could. She saw how much weight he carried on his shoulders and admired the way he handled it. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of training, she found him sitting alone near the edge of the base, staring out at the horizon. The sun was setting, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and red. "You doing okay?" she asked, lowering herself onto the grass beside him. He glanced at her, offering a small smile. "Yeah, I'm fine, just thinking." "About what?" He hesitated, picking at a blade of grass before answering. "Everything, I guess. Dawson, the general, the guys. Sometimes it feels like I'm walking this tightrope, like I have to be perfect all the time." Elena nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "You don't have to be perfect," she said gently. "Just be honest. People respect that more than anything else." Her words stayed with him long after their conversation ended. Honesty, that was something he could hold on to, something that felt real amidst the chaos. Over the next few weeks, he leaned into it, opening up to his fellow recruits in ways he hadn't before. During breaks between drills, he shared stories about growing up in a tough neighborhood, about the struggles that had shaped him, and the dreams that kept him going. In turn, they opened up to him, sharing pieces of themselves they'd kept hidden. Slowly but surely, the walls began to come down, not just for him, but for everyone. As the months passed, the changes on the base became undeniable. Morale improved, camaraderie grew stronger, and the recruits pushed each other to excel, not out of fear, but out of mutual respect. Even the new drill sergeant assigned to replace Dawson noticed the difference. Sergeant Morales was a stark contrast to her predecessor, firm but fair, demanding excellence while treating everyone with dignity. Under her guidance, the recruits flourished, their progress evident in every aspect of their training. The young recruit thrived too. His resilience during the darkest days under Dawson had forged a strength within him that couldn't be shaken. He excelled in every challenge thrown his way, earning accolades not just for his physical prowess, but also for his leadership skills. When conflicts arose among the group, he stepped in to mediate, using patience and empathy to resolve tensions. His actions inspired others to follow suit, creating a ripple effect that transformed the dynamic of the entire unit. By the time graduation day arrived, the transformation was complete. The recruits who had once been strangers now stood side by side as brothers and sisters in arms, united by shared experiences and newfound trust. As they marched onto the field for the ceremony, pride radiated from every face. For the young recruit, it was a moment of triumph, a culmination of everything he had fought for since arriving at the base. When his name was called to receive his certificate, the applause was thunderous. General Callahan himself presented, it shaking his hand with a look of genuine admiration. "You've earned this," the general said quietly so only the recruit could hear. "Your father would have been proud." Later that night, as the celebration wound down and the recruits gathered around a bonfire, the young man reflected on how far he'd come. He thought about Dawson, the anger, the insults, the late-night scrubbing of latrines, and realized something profound. None of it mattered anymore. What mattered was what he had chosen to do with it. He had turned pain into purpose, adversity into growth, and hate into hope. As the flames danced in front of him, casting flickering shadows on the faces of his comrades, he raised a cup in a silent toast. To perseverance, to unity, and to the belief that even in the hardest moments there's always a chance to rise above. Months had passed since graduation day, and the young recruit who had once stood silently in formation under Dawson's harsh gaze was now a fully fledged soldier. The transformation wasn't just physical, it was mental, emotional, and spiritual. He carried himself differently now, with a quiet confidence that came from knowing he'd faced his toughest battles and emerged stronger for it. But this wasn't the end of his journey. If anything, it was just the beginning. The division buzzed with activity as new recruits arrived, their nervous energy filling the air like static. Among them were fresh faces eager to prove themselves, but also older soldiers returning from deployments, hardened by experience, yet ready to adapt to changing times. The reforms General Callahan had implemented were taking root, reshaping not only how people trained, but also how they treated each other. Respect, accountability, and teamwork weren't just words anymore. They were principles etched into the fabric of daily life on the base. For the young soldier, the transition from recruit to leader happened gradually. At first, he found himself mentoring newer members, sharing tips on surviving drills or navigating the complexities of military life. His advice wasn't always technical. It often revolved around mindset. "It's not about avoiding mistakes," he'd tell them during breaks between exercises. "It's about learning from them and moving forward." These small moments of guidance earned him trust, and soon enough, others began seeking him out for more than just training pointers. One evening, after a long day of field exercises, Sergeant Morales approached him. She had taken notice of his steady demeanor and natural ability to connect with others. "How would you feel about stepping into a leadership role?" she asked, her tone casual but probing. He hesitated, surprised by the question. Leadership roles weren't handed out lightly, and he knew the responsibility would be immense. "I'm honored, Sergeant," he replied carefully, "but are you sure I'm ready?" Morales smiled, leaning against the hood of a nearby Jeep. "You've already been leading whether you realize it or not. People look up to you not because of what happened with Dawson, but because of how you handled it. You didn't let bitterness define you. That's rare." Her words stayed with him long after their conversation ended. It wasn't just about titles or rank. It was about influence. He thought back to all the times Dawson had tried to break him. All the nights he'd lain awake wondering if he belonged here. And now, standing on the brink of something bigger, he realized that every challenge, every insult, every moment of doubt had prepared him for this. As weeks turned into months, his new responsibilities became second nature. Leading wasn't just about giving orders. It was about listening, understanding, and guiding. During one particularly grueling exercise, a young recruit struggled to keep up with the rest of the group. Exhaustion weighed heavily on them, and frustration bubbled over as they stumbled repeatedly through an obstacle course. Instead of barking commands or singling them out, the young soldier walked alongside them, offering calm encouragement. "You're not failing," he said, matching their pace. "You're figuring it out. Take your time, there's no shame in that." The recruit glanced at him, startled by the kindness in his voice. For a moment they hesitated, then nodded and pushed forward, completing the task without further incident. Later, when the group gathered for debriefing, the same recruit approached him. "Thank you," they murmured, their voice barely audible. "I thought I was going to give up." He smiled, patting them on the shoulder. "Giving up is easy. Pushing through? That's where the real growth happens." Moments like these reminded him why he'd chosen this path in the first place. It wasn't about glory or recognition. It was about making a difference, even in small ways. Every person he helped, every lesson he shared, added another brick to the foundation of the legacy he wanted to leave behind. Meanwhile, news of Dawson's fate trickled back to the base. Stripped of his rank and discharged dishonorably, he faded into obscurity. A cautionary tale whispered among soldiers about the dangers of letting prejudice cloud judgment. Some felt pity for him, wondering if he might have changed given the chance. Others saw his downfall as inevitable, a reminder that unchecked hatred could consume even the strongest individuals. But the young soldier didn't dwell on Dawson's story. Instead, he focused on building bridges, fostering unity within the ranks and proving that strength wasn't measured by dominance but by compassion. Under his guidance, the unit thrived. Teamwork improved, morale soared, and performance metrics reached new heights. Even those who had initially doubted him came to admire his approach, realizing that true leadership wasn't about control. It was about empowerment. Years later, as he rose through the ranks, earning promotions and accolades along the way, he never forgot where he started. On quiet nights when the weight of responsibility felt overwhelming, he'd think back to those early days, the endless push-ups, the biting insults, the late-night scrubbing of latrines, and remind himself of the lessons he'd learned. Resilience wasn't about never falling. It was about getting back up every time you did. Forgiveness wasn't weakness, it was strength. And courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was acting despite it. When asked about his journey during interviews or ceremonies, he kept his responses simple, almost humble. "Some people will always try to bring you down," he'd say, his voice steady and sincere. "But if you stay true to yourself, they'll never succeed." His story became legend within the division, passed down from one generation of soldiers to the next. New recruits heard tales of the young man who had stood up to a tyrant, not with anger or vengeance, but with dignity and grace. They learned about the reforms that followed, the culture shift that transformed the base into a place of respect and inclusion, and most importantly, they learned that change was possible, not overnight but through persistence, patience, and belief in something better. On the day he received his highest honor, a medal awarded for exceptional leadership, he stood before a crowd of fellow soldiers, officers, and dignitaries. The applause was thunderous, but he remained grounded, his thoughts drifting to everyone who had played a part in his journey. To Elena, whose quiet support had meant more than she realized. To General Callahan, whose faith in him had sparked a fire within. And even to Dawson, whose cruelty had unknowingly forged the resolve that defined him. "None of us gets here alone," he said during his acceptance speech, his voice carrying across the room. "We rise because others lift us up. We grow because we learn from our struggles. And we lead because we choose to serve, not ourselves but each other." As the ceremony concluded and the crowd dispersed, he stepped outside, breathing in the crisp evening air. The stars stretched endlessly above him, a reminder of how vast the world was and how much work remained to be done. But for now, in this moment, he allowed himself to feel proud, not just of what he'd achieved, but of the example he hoped to set for those who would follow in his footsteps. Because in the end, it wasn't about titles, medals, or legacies. It was about the impact you left on the people around you, and the knowledge that, no matter how hard the road, staying true to yourself was always worth it.